Hi everyone, so I'm Rachel, Rachele, you can call me whatever you like. So today we're going to talk a little bit about crime, gender, prison and punishment. So I wanted to start by kind of outlining these four main concepts actually guide my research. They guided my PhD that I recently completed. And so I want to start a little bit with the connection that we can make between crime and gender. So before doing that, I have a little bit of a trigger warning for you. So throughout this short presentation, I might be talking around issues of violence and trauma. So if you need to take care of yourself, feel free to do so. Feel free to get another drink and just do whatever you can to make sure that you take care of yourself, basically. This is not kind of like a trigger warning, maybe like a content warning. So I will be talking about gender in binary terms. I know it's very boring, but for the sake of, this kind of conversation, I will be talking about men and women. This is not to overshadow the experiences of people who fall within or outside of gender binary, also because my research actually is in queer criminology, so I do focus on the experiences of these kind of more marginalized communities. But more specifically, we're going to talk about women today, which is something I really love to talk about. So it's going to be a little bit of an interactive session. We're going to have questions at the end, but if you have a very pressing question, feel free to just raise your hand. There's going to be a little activity that we can do together, and hopefully it's going to be fun. So I'm going to start with sort of like a case study, something to set the scene for our conversation around the connection between crime and gender. Who knows who this woman is? It's not Lady Gaga, if you're asking. It's not Lady Gaga. It's not Marilyn Monroe. But does anyone know who this woman is? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so her name was Ruth Ellis. She was the last woman to be executed in the United Kingdom. She was executed in 1955. And she's a very interesting kind of case study for us to think about crime and gender. So she became kind of sort of famous in London for nude modeling, which you might think about during the time was a bit of like a taboo occupation. And she was 28 when she committed her crimes. She murdered her lover, with which she had a very abusive relationship involving physical and sexual violence. She was arrested on the 10th of April, 1955, and in July she was executed. So quite quickly. She was executed in Holloway Prison, which was a prison located in London, and until 2016 it was actually the largest women's prison in Western Europe. So it's quite interesting to think about a case, specifically when looking at reports. So reports mention that every senior officer took one good look at Ellis' bleached hair and heavy makeup and immediately decided she was facing the gallows, so she was facing the death penalty. So that's quite interesting. It tells us something about her appearance that somehow made her look more dangerous. We can look at other examples that are a bit more contemporary, like Amanda Knox. So, she was wrongfully convicted for killing her roommate. She was found innocent eventually, but she was really demonized by the media for her, alleged promiscuous sexual relationships. Similarly, we have Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley was one of the most murders. She committed a number of crimes against children, and in which she was actually dubbed the most evil woman in Britain. And another more recent case is that of Lucy Letby, and again, she committed a number of crimes against children, and similarly, she was demonized by the media for kind of being something really kind of unnatural, because women are supposed to be nurturing and caring towards children. So what is interesting is that there is something around gender that informs the ways in which we think about criminality. And crime is said to be a gendered category, meaning that men and women who commit crimes are treated quite differently within the criminal justice system. And this was actually very interesting for me to look at. There are a number of elements that are kind of set to be kind of feminine standards that women have to live up to. And when they don't, they're actually treated much more harshly by society at large and by the criminal justice system. And I kind of tried to summarize these kind of points. So we have domesticity. So women should be domestic. They should be relegated in the kind of domestic sphere. They should, stay in the kitchen and not be breadwinners. And kind of, while the public, the outside world is the men's sphere, the inside the home is actually the female sphere. Women should also be passive. Of course, not violent, not assertive, not aggressive, but nurturing, caring, loving, and mothering, right? And women should also be chaste. So chastity is also another kind of element that informs the way in which we think about femininity. Women should not be promiscuous, should only engage in sex if it is within a marital and monogamous relationship, and only vanilla sex. It's quite boring. So these are elements that we think might be very outdated when we think about that, like they don't really match our contemporary progressive and transformative society. But in reality, what I do argue in my work is that these elements still inform a lot of the processes that are going on within the criminal justice system. So the ways in which we think about women when they deviate, when they are they don't portray these expected kind of characteristics. So there is also a lot of kind of conversation around the fact that women might be treated more leniently by the criminal justice system. Don't worry, there is statistical evidence showing that is not the case. There's a lot of research showing that women are not treated more leniently by the system. But actually, we do know that some women are actually treated more harshly. And the women that are those that kind of fail the gender test. They fail to portray these elements of domesticity, passivity, and chastity. And these women are defined as doubly deviant. So double deviant it's a concept that we use to think about women who not only break the law by committing a crime, but they also break those traditional norms that we associate with femininity, right? So they don't portray these expected characteristics, as I said before. But it is a bit more complicated than that. So our identities are said to be intersectional, meaning that there are other elements that inform the ways in which women are treated in society and in the criminal justice system. So we might think about the ways in which race, class, disability, religion, and so on, they inform, they generate very complex experiences in the first place, but they also inform the ways in which women are processed in the justice system. So for example, we know that poor women of color are often overrepresented and mistreated in our prison system in the UK. So what does it have to do with prisons? What is the main point? So if crime is gendered, punishment is gendered, right? So there is a tight connection between the ways in which crime is gendered and also the ways in which punishment is devised to kind of manage unruly women. In the context of prison, they're said to be a men's world. So this is an institution that's been designed by men for men. Why? More strictly speaking, because men make up the highest percentage of people in prison. So the image that you can see there is a map of the prison system in England and Wales. So these are all the prisons that are in England and Wales. We have different prison systems in the UK. And in my work, I focus on England and Wales simply because there's the highest kind of concentration of women's prisons. More specifically, England, because there's no women's prisons in Wales. So there's 10 facilities for women in England. And I would like to give you some insights about the population that is housed there. So they're 4% of the total prison population. We know that women are actually convicted for non-violent offenses. So despite all the super sensational stories that you hear about in the media about women being super violent and aggressive and committing these kind of obscene crimes, the vast majority of crimes committed by women it's very boring. Most of the time, women are convicted for not paying TV license or not paying council tax. It's another interesting element, kind of consideration that we can do around women in prison is that actually they share very complex histories of trauma, sexual violence, domestic violence. And so kind of being a men's world, the prison is not currently equipped to deal with these complexities. So this problem has been denounced in the Coston Report, which is like an official document published in 2007, where basically Baroness Coston kind of reported the fact that women's prisons were not actually dealing with the gender-specific issues that were affecting women who were actually incarcerated. So the system didn't really take into account that these women were sharing trauma. They came in the system with substance misuse, with mental health issues. So there's been kind of a move towards recognizing these very specific issues that affect women in our current criminal justice system. So to kind of tie in these kind of elements with my work on prison spaces, I decided to do a little activity with you guys. And I think, it can make us think a little bit about what we think when we think about prison spaces. What do they look like? So the game that we're going to play together is called, Is This a Prison? And that's a tome that you have to, that's the title. So I'm going to show you a couple of images, and you really have to tell me if you think that that is a prison, more specifically a women's prison, or just another facility, whatever. So you can raise your hand, you can scream, you can stand up. So if you think it is a prison, scream, stand up, raise your hand. If you don't think that is a prison, just don't move, stay still. Are we good to go?
Yes.
All right, cool. So, first image. Is this a prison or not?
Yes.
Very small percentage of the people is like, yes, it's a prison. All right, cool. So this is actually, yeah, it is a prison. Well, it's a radical prison. That's a fancy way to put it. So it's a community custodial unit, yeah, in Scotland, and it's basically housing women that are ready to engage with the community. So women who need very low supervision. That's why you can see that there's no kind of bars on the windows, and it looks quite pretty. All right, cool. Next. Is this a prison?
No.
No. No.
This is the library.
It is. It is a prison for some of us. For some of us, it's a prison. But no, yeah, it's a Stockwell Street library. You can admire the building a couple of meters from here. But it does look a little bit like a prison. All right, good. What about this one?
Yes.
You don't seem too confident. That's a very confident yes, but no. Okay. Yeah. No, it's a prison. Yeah, it is a prison. Yeah. So that's a rendering. It's not a proper image, but that's a rendering of Limerick Women's Prisons in Ireland. So it opened in 2023. It was a refurbished women's wing. And it's basically it's considered an architecture of hope because you can see it looks nothing like a prison. They use bright colors, there's no bars on the windows. They organize the space in a ways in which there's natural light coming in, there's contact with nature, you can see there's trees outside. So it doesn't really look like a prison at all. Okay, last one. Is that a prison?
No.
That's the Britannia Edinburgh Hotel. The room looks like a prison cell. And they're actually right. So, yeah. Okay, good. All right. So there's a bit of mixed responses. But ideally, this was all to kind of bring forward the fact that there is this kind of, just conversation around prison becoming nicer and nicer, even like too nice, to the point where it's like, I don't really feel comfortable with that. So on the one hand, there's some truth to it. So we're trying to kind of, not me, but like prison designers and prison architects in relation, like connected to kind of researchers, are trying to organize spaces in women's prisons in a way that is trauma informed. So it's not traumatizing for women who have already been traumatized throughout their life. And being trauma informed, there's the use of kind of natural light, as I said before, of like pastel colors, bright colors, because these kind of spatial elements do affect individuals' kind of behavior and eventually also their rehabilitation. But the reality of women's prisons is much more complicated than that. So don't be fooled by what you see, that what makes the headlines, because unfortunately there's still very kind of complex experiences in women's prisons. This is a prison in Wood Park, and women are housed in blood-stained cells. There's other information if someone looks a little bit closer. In this report, we see that 20 women are being held, can only use like 2 toilets. There's ant infestation, mold dump, and these women are, they're not, most of the time, they have to spend 22 hours a day in their cells because of the lack of hygiene and, the very horrible living condition that they're experiencing. So even if the headlines are saying, oh, these places look pretty, following what's called like the Scandinavian model, so the models of prisons in Northern Europe, don't be fooled. This is not the whole reality of women's prisons. And in my work, what I try to understand is that, okay, so, what is the function of these spaces for women? Because we know that crime is gendered, so we know that women are treated differently because they commit crimes, because it kind of goes against their nature. So in my work, I argue that prisons I argue, connected to a long-standing tradition of academics, that women's prisons are not simply just places of punishment, but they are places of reformation. So these places are informed by the idea that women should be reformed into appropriate feminine beings, right? Appropriate gendered beings. And how does it do that? Did it do that? Through a concept that I borrowed from Barbara Sazzo called pastoral fascism. So I think it's a very kind of catchy way to put it. So fascism brings us back to this idealized past, right? Where women were only wives and mothers. But the idea of bringing us back to these past is through a pastoral strategies. So it's not through overt violence, but is by making plays as appealing as possible. So this type of reformation is much more insidious than just clear overt violence. To make it a bit more practical, I conducted, as part of my PhD, I conducted a document analysis of a number of documents around women's prisons. These include prison reports and official documents. And I found a number of interesting elements that connect to this idea of reformation, which I called perverse normalization. So normalization is a concept that has been used by prison architects and designers. So to build the prison space, they have to make it as normal as possible. So to make life in prison resemble life on the outside. And this is the idea that, we can prepare people for the outside if they make prison spaces look like the outside world. There's a problem with that. Firstly, normality is actually terrifying for some people. So some people come from their very complex, very traumatizing life experiences, and for them, normality is actually what they're trying to escape. So thinking about normality as something, that kind of like a homogeneous term that means the same for everyone is a bit of a problem. But for women, this idea of normalization is perverse because normality seems to be bringing us back to the idea of fascism, going back to women being passive, being nurturing, being mothering. So I looked a little bit around at like physical and sexual healthcare, and you can see that from what I found, there's little information around reproductive healthcare based on the idea that women should be chaste, right? So they shouldn't engage in promiscuous sex, especially in prison. So there's little information around kind of contraception, sexual health testing, STI testing, and the need of pregnant women are only taken into account when they are giving birth. And even then, I don't know if you've heard, the headlines of women being chained to the prison, to the hospital beds while giving birth. So even then, their rights are really kind of not really taken into account. But an interesting thing is that not only these things are women, but these things are not available, but other things that women can use for their self-expression are really not available. Simple things like toothpaste. Participants said, very mundane stuff. And also, mundane stuff like toothpaste in prison tastes differently because people are only able to buy like the very cheap versions of stuff. And so talking to participants who've worked in prison say, well, women are often kind of very, they criticize a lot the availability of the products because you get very like weird tasting toothpaste. Similarly for sanitary pads, they're not able to purchase them. And when they can, you get like this very like massive like nappies style kind of sanitary pads are not very comfortable for those who, can menstruate in the room. So these things are not available. And it goes back to the idea that women should be passive, should be chaste, and they shouldn't engage in sex. Similarly, mental health care was considered an all women issue. And this is problematic because we assume that all women in prison have a mental health issue. There is some truth to it. So some women, there's a lot of women who enter the prison system with mental health issues because of the trauma they experienced. But to make this direct connection is a bit problematic because it assumes that because women are in prison and they've committed a crime, they're crazy. So we take away their agency in actually committing the crime. And we know that women commit crimes for a variety of reasons, including poverty. And another problematic thing that goes back to this idea of reformation is work. So work in prison has followed kind of a traditional feminine tropes. So the work available in prison for women is connected to body work. So, beauty training, hairdressing, cooking, and catering, traditional female occupation. There is an attempt to diversify the curriculum, But of course, you can imagine that, if these are similar to the kind of opportunities that women have in the outside world, which is quite gendered, women who are, especially the women who live in quite poor socioeconomic conditions, are much more prone to choose those feminine occupations. And of course, I mentioned all those spatial issues that in my kind of, way of thinking, go back to the idea that women should be passive. So if you live in a place that it's infested by, ants and vermin, there's nothing you can do, right? So there's a little bit about this idea of kind of, you have to be passive to what happens to you. And some people might say, well, this is also what happened in men's prison. And I argue that is not the point. What I do say in my work is that that's not really the point of the whole thing. The point is, rather than women's kind of treatment within the criminal justice system, is very much influenced by their gender and these kind of very ingrained assumptions. So the last bit is about justice. So what does it have to do with justice? So I argue that these problematic ideas around femininity are still very much ingrained and rooted in our criminal justice system and in society at large. The problem with that is that people that don't fit within these narrow categories are going to be demonized and are going to be treated more harshly. And so this is a massive barrier to justice. And the last bit is that for women specifically, and this is something that I kind of expand to also people that are not cisgender women, but punishment is both public and private, meaning that it's public, so it's formal. People, they will go to prison, but it's also private because it aims at reforming them into gendered beings through informal and at times quite insidious and problematic tactics that are not, too visible. All right. Thank you.